we use it wisely to make great decisions for the people of the state of Georgia. Let every heart be open to change, positive change that would be beneficial to the people of Georgia as well as America. Thank you for safe travel here and for. Thank you, Father, for the blessing of this day in every aspects. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for joining us here this morning live, and for those of you that are joining us via Zoom as well. I know we have some committee members that we'll be having come in via Zoom or WebEx in just a few minutes as well, so we'll recognize them when they get here. Before we dive into our agenda this morning, I do want to recognize Dr. Chairman Senator Ben Watson, who's going to share a few words with us about his home city here, as well as the place of work that he called home for a number of years.
It is. Thank you, Chairman. I was just telling Chairman Harbison that I had just stopped going to the hospital after about 34 years here at Memorial. Still do private practice, outpatient care, and my badge still works, so I was really happy about that this morning. Just about Savannah and our area is that if we remember back a few years ago, from a population standpoint, there were only two areas outside of Metro Atlanta that grew and kept up with the Metro Atlanta area. One was Columbia County, which is just west of Augusta, and the other was our metro area here, Effingham, Chatham, Bryan counties. Those grew, and actually my district I had to give up because I had grown more, my district area had grown more than the Metro Atlanta area. The rest of the coast, believe it or not, down south of us did not grow. They actually had a little bit of a negative population from that standpoint. So a little bit of a clarification there. Savannah itself is booming from that perspective. Our tourism is about 14 million a year. About a third of those spend the night, a night or two. We have large manufacturing presence, 12,000 employees at Gulfstream, and we're about to plop down another industry about the same size with Hyundai in North Bryan, which is our metro area. So that's probably, it's going to have 8,000 on site and about total of about 16,000 in our area. Go all the way up to Candler County, which is Metter, goes down to Liberty County. These are suppliers and tier 1 suppliers. Over to Effingham County and so forth. So the area from that perspective, manufacturing is a major industry. Everybody knows about the Georgia Ports Authority that goes down to Brunswick with the largest roll-on and roll-off facility in the nation. We are the third largest container vessel here in Savannah. Specifically, New York, New Jersey, and LA, Long Beach is larger, and we're number 3. Probably will overtake one of those in the near future. I know that the Georgia Port State of the Port addressed us last week, and he's talking about being all in and being progressive. And, we have had a lot of things going on with that. Military is another major industry here in our area. We have 37% of all active duty military in the state of Georgia at Fort Stewart and Hunter, which is our metro area. Education, another major player in our area with SCAD, with over 10,000 students in the city. Been a major renovator of historical properties here in our area. Of course, Georgia Southern Armstrong with the medical school coming on board in the near future, and maybe more in the future relating to that. And then Savannah State, of which the Lieutenant Governor is touring here in a few minutes, and is a very important minutes, and is a very important
But she left a little bit early. It made me Not at all. That, yeah. But she left a little bit early. It made me Not at all. That, yeah.
Now, and one of the things that a lot of communities, the communities always, always looking for the same thing. I don't care what community you're in. People want good quality of life, and that is always centered around job opportunities, educational opportunities, and then also healthcare access. And so we're taking a good hard look at what our certificate of need process looks like right now, and looking to make some changes. But I appreciate everybody being involved in the process, particularly the associations who are both for and against this. We don't want to try to ram something through that doesn't have everybody everybody having a seat at the table. And I know that Senator Dolezal and the chairman here has told me about how well all associations and all the partners have been working with our office, and I greatly appreciate that. And hopefully we'll come out of here with some great recommendations. So I appreciate the service all of you have done on this. I appreciate our citizens services on here. I know we've had people from, Piedmont and other entities that are on here as well. So just glad to be here, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Governor. We're happy to have you here. I drove around this morning. I didn't know if I was at a hospital or a college campus due to the size and scope of this facility. For those of you that are viewing online, we are sitting in a room in the midst of a really stunning campus here in Savannah. And I would like to call Brad Talbert from HCA Memorial forward to share a few words about the work that they're doing here in the city. If you can come down right here, please.
Well, thank you, Senator. Appreciate the committee being here today. Welcome to Savannah. I can't say anything more about our area than Senator Watson did. That was a great Chamber of Commerce speech, and so I'll let Burt Brantley know that his job may be on the line if things don't work out in the Senate. But no, Burt's a great friend of the hospital and doing great things for our community since he arrived earlier this year. But Memorial Health, as you touched on just a moment ago, is a significant player in the healthcare space in South Georgia, but also an economic factor in South Georgia. And I think that's important for the committee and the folks watching online to understand. Last year alone, we treated over 280,000 people for some sort of healthcare condition across our various healthcare offerings. And so we truly do serve South Georgia. Our service area is 35 counties. And predominantly, obviously, Chatham County and our close surrounding counties, but we reach out as far as 35 counties. Level 1 trauma center. We have a 92-bed level 3 NICU, the only level 3 NICU in South Georgia, the only dedicated children's hospital in South Georgia, with the opening of the Children's Hospital of Savannah just a couple of years ago. We have a number of acute care offerings as well as a strong residency GME program. We have a great relationship with Mercer University. Their School of Medicine is here on campus as well. So in addition to our 150 some odd residents that we have in the GME program training here on campus, we also at any given time have 250 medical students as well that are all going to be committed to serving Georgia when they graduate, which I think is a great thing. So again, I could give a really great commercial for Memorial Health, but with our 4,200 employees here, over 800 physicians, we mean a lot to this community from an economic standpoint as well. We pay a lot in taxes each and every year, over $65 million in charity care alone provided last year in addition to that. So we're a good community resource, we're a good community steward, and we just appreciate the committee being here today on our campus. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Brad.
Yes, sir.
Really appreciate you hosting us this morning, and appreciated and enjoyed our conversation we were able to have offline on the topic of CONs. Thank you for your insight. We're going to have 4 presenters this morning, and there's a sign-up sheet in the hallway for anybody who would like to speak during our general public testimony time. Each of the 4 members are going to have 10 minutes to present. I would like you to stay as close to that as you can because we do have a hard stop for a few of our members. And then we'll open it up to the committee for any questions, which the Q&A tends to be the most robust and helpful part of this process. So with that, would like to welcome up our former colleague and dear friend. He's listed here as Dr. Dean Burke. He'll always be Senator to us. So Senator Burke, if you could come forward. And committee members, we have a deck here, and I believe there's going to be slides as well for those in the audience for Dr. Burke's presentation.
Good morning. It's good to be with y'all. It's great to be in the wonderful city of Savannah again. As the CEO of the hospital was talking earlier, it brought me back being to the summer of 1980. I was a medical student doing a senior surgery rotation here on this campus. And what I got to do during that month would probably make a residency director cringe because, you know, if somebody came in with a laceration, this senior medical student stitched them up. They had a broken bone, we worked them up. And I'm afraid some of that's been lost as we've taken more care to protect patients, which is obviously very important, but we've also lost a little bit of the training aspect of being thrown in the deep end of the pool. But I really enjoyed my time here. I want to bring greetings from Russell Carlson, the commissioner and department. We've been asked to present a brief overview today of the DPP program, Directed Payment Program, to make sure people are up to date on the changes that have occurred since that was implemented over the last couple of years. We had several sessions with the legislature, educational sessions last session to try to let people know what it was about. But now that we have more data coming in and we're required to report every year to CMS the quality aspects and update them on this, because this isn't, unlike a lot of programs, it's required to be updated annually. So I'm going to introduce Cody Whitlock, our new CFO. In the interest of time, I've had several other things I wanted to talk about, but we'll limit that today and then cover them in questions. I will be doing the closing and have some slides of some rural facilities in this region that I want to just highlight what's going on, the good and the bad and the ugly. So, Cody, can you introduce our speakers?
Thank you, Dr. Burke, members of the committee. Cody Whitlock, I'm the Chief Financial Officer of the Department of Community Health. With us today are 2 members of Sellers Dorsey. They've been very helpful in implementing the Directed Payment Program. So I'd just like to introduce them real quick. It's Tanya Boone. She's been with Sellers Dorsey for quite some time, really detailed in Medicaid financing. I believe most of y'all know Martha Wickton, who's with Sellers Dorsey as well. So if y'all want to come up and go ahead and present.
Thank you. Great to be here. So this will be a challenge because we have about 8 minutes, but I'll try to go through a very complex topic in about 8 minutes or so, and then turn back over to Dr. Burke. So, I'm controlling this. Okay. So I think the most important piece, if I could start, is that directed payment programs, if there's 3 things to leave you with. Number one, they are beneficial to providers and to the communities and patients they serve, but it's not a magic wand. So it's a benefit, but it doesn't solve a lot of the financial challenges that hospitals have. Number 2, they're highly variable in terms of the amount of impact that these programs are. It really depends on a hospital's patient mix, the services they provide, and ultimately the size of their payments is based on the mothers and babies that they serve in Medicaid, specifically. Number 3, there's actually no state general revenue that supports these programs because of the way that they're designed through provider assessments and intergovernmental transfers by public hospitals. So those are the 3 overarching statements I wanted to make to begin with. The slide here has some of the specifics on directed payment programs. So the first point is essentially that they're relatively new. It's from 2016 that CMS put out guidance on directed payment programs. What they are is a state Medicaid agency is able to direct payments through managed care organizations onto providers. So that's what it refers to. Number 2, I mentioned this, but Medicaid is partially state, partially federal, federally funded, and these programs in particular are able to utilize provider fees and intergovernmental transfers, so no state general revenue. The next point here I mentioned as well, these are highly variable based on specifically CMO utilization within hospitals, so there's an add-on payment. But the point is that the payments are tied to Medicaid utilization, but at the end of the day, the intent is to improve patient outcomes in those populations. So specifically mothers and babies in Georgia, because those are the populations in managed care. There are essentially 5 programs that DCH in the state has worked on over the last few years, and we're going to go through some of the specifics on those. So ultimately, directed payments are meant to support the policy and goals of the state. So you can see here, improving health services and experience and smarter spending. Overall, there are several programs that work in concert with each other. So you all have probably heard about the Georgia Aid program that originally intended to support Grady and Augusta University Medical Center, a hospital-directed payment program that supports public and private hospitals throughout the state, and then ultimately the Georgia Strong program. I will say that also these programs, these directed payment programs, serve to free up DISH funding to support rural hospitals. So that's another component of the overall program. Okay, there are a lot of words on this page, but I'll point out a couple of things. At the top, you see the purpose of each of the program. They each do a little different things and have different goals. There are metrics tied to all of these programs. So there is annual approval by CMS, and they look for an evaluation plan and how the providers are doing in terms of their goals and meeting the metrics that have been laid out. So again, annual approval. You can see here the number of providers, the program size. These are very big dollars. And I'll mention again the non-federal share component. You can see for each of these programs how they're funded in terms of the state share. Bottom line is the initial approval date. So you can see these have really come into existence in the last 2 years. Okay. All right. So now we get into the waterfall. Folks have probably heard about that. The idea of this DPP as well is that there is new funding available that then can offset and allow for increased DISH dollars to flow to small rural hospitals. So up at the top, you see essentially how things looked back in 2022, which is that $493 million are available to Georgia hospitals for DISH funding. And there was a set amount that would flow to the small rural hospitals, and that was $76 million. The urban and non-small rural pools, essentially the remainder of the pool flowed to them. So in 2023, this looks different, and you'll see some of the graphs coming up here. But essentially, the size of the pool increased because of primarily inflation. But now what happens is the state decided to move forward with a methodology to completely fill the uncompensated care costs for Medicaid specifically for the small rural pool. And the remainder then flows to the urban and non-small rural pool. Okay, in terms of how the calculations are done, each program is a little different. The Georgia Aid program is an individual average commercial rate. There are dollars at risk, so about 10% of dollars at risk. The Georgia Strong program is a uniform percent increase, but 10 to 20% of those funds are reinvested specifically in workforce activities. And this was something that DCH and the state really looked to hospitals to be able to report out where those funds are invested. And a lot of the providers are investing in partners as well, community colleges, and working on workforce challenges. On the bottom, I just wanted to point out the estimated impact ranges. This gets to the variability, so you can see some hospitals benefit quite significantly, but there are about 53 hospitals that benefit between $15,000 and $1 million a year. Okay, these are some of the questions that have been raised previously. I'm actually going to skip over this and just point out the formula at the bottom here, and so that we can get into some of the examples. But essentially, the important part of uncompensated care costs is there is a formula, and it's essentially Medicaid costs. Then you subtract out all the Medicaid payments, including directed payment programs. So it's Medicaid shortfall. So essentially where Medicaid costs, the cost of providing care, exceeds payments. So that's your Medicaid shortfall. The remainder is uninsured costs minus uninsured payments. So that essentially, that dollar amount is the amount of DSH that you can receive, that a provider can receive. It's also referred to, I try not to use a lot of acronyms because there's a ton of them in this space, but HSL is hospital-specific limit. So that gets to the total amount that a hospital could receive for DSH dollars. And the reason why that's important is because there was a change, as I mentioned, as a result from the directed payment programs to completely fill the HSL for rural hospitals. Now that is only for Medicaid shortfall and uncompensated care for uninsured and low-income patients. So what it doesn't incorporate in, and Dr. Burke will get into this, is bad debt. So that is a major component of a lot of financial challenges for rural hospitals especially, but all hospitals. Okay, so this gets into the DSH and uncompensated care costs in terms of the total amount that existed in 2022 versus 2023. So you can see there's a big change from the small rural pool, which still had $99 million of uncompensated care costs, again, as defined by Medicaid, and the urban and non-small rural, which was $1.5 billion. Now, moving forward to 2023, you can see the impact of these programs. $0 in terms of paying the small rural pool up to what they can receive for Medicaid uncompensated care cost coverage. Well, that's DSH. Again, I'll remind folks that there's also the component where a lot of the hospitals pay through their hospital authorities, and as a public hospital, they pay an intergovernmental transfer. So you'll see that in the next slide as well. And you can also see that uncompensated care costs greatly reduced for the urban and non-small hospitals. Okay. This is, Dr. Burke will actually go through the impact specifically on some of the small rural hospitals in the area.
Thank you, Tanya. And we'll be brief, but I think the map here is a good representation. The blue represents rural hospitals and rural counties. So obviously the state is dominated by those facilities. And again, the hospital finance, and I was chairing that budget that Dr. Watson has now for 8 years. And every year I learned a little more and a little more, but I'm still learning about hospital finance and the intricate relationship between CMS and the federal partners that we have. But I do think it's important to emphasize that the directed payment program results in DSH money that is freed up from the bigger facilities because they're hitting their hospital-specific limit. And so that's where that waterfall thing came from, is that extra DSH money gets to fill up the HSL or hospital-specific limit for the rurals. And that's a huge deal. It's cash that those hospitals didn't have, before this was implemented. But I think it's important to realize that if you look at this slide, the 34 million at the top, that hatched area, is the intergovernmental transfers or bed tax payments, depending on whether it's a public or private entity. So this funding is coming from themselves, that the feds are matching. It's not a state-funded program. The state has to run it and enforce it to make sure we're hitting the quality metrics, but it's not our money. The light blue represents the DSH, and then the new money is the DPP down at the bottom. And what I'm trying to do today, because we have the rural hospital tax credit that several of you were in the Senate when we passed that, and our former lieutenant governor was the House sponsor for that bill, and I was the Senate sponsor. And it provides money to the rurals. And at the time of this presentation, the last number was 58 million, which is, again, a great thing. But what's important to realize, and this slide is what I call the big picture. Those three buckets on the left represent the DPP and the DSH money and the rural hospital tax credit money. The other three columns are the bad debt, indigent care, and charity care numbers that the rural still have. So I think it's real important to understand that while that extra $30 million down at the bottom is great for those facilities, it doesn't come anywhere close to making them whole from the standpoint of their financial struggles. And these dollars or these numbers are presented every year. Have the rural hospitals to participate in that rural hospital tax credit, they have to produce audited financial statements. So these numbers are coming from that program because they have to keep at least a 10% shortfall to be eligible for that rural hospital tax credit. And the question was, okay, would DPP make a big dent in making those people not be eligible anymore because financially they're whole, so to speak? And the numbers bring out what the rural hospital CEOs tell us all the time. Before DPP, their indigent care, charity care, and bad debt was about 30, represented on average across all the hospitals, about 34%. And after DPP, it's down to 31 to 32%. So while it is a new money for rural hospitals that are desperately needed, I think these slides represent well the fact that the other programs that we're providing rural hospitals, whether it's the rural hospital stabilization grants that are out there, the rural hospital tax credit, all of these programs are necessary. And I would argue, as someone who spent the last 30 years working in a rural hospital and the last 10 being an executive in one, we have a lot more work to do to stabilize those facilities if we want them to remain open and provide a safety net for those people that are living in rural Georgia. And these slides here are just representative of the same thing that I won't go into because of time, but I did want to show a couple slides showing the actual facilities in this region. This is one from Liberty Medical, and as you can see, their bad debt represents $17 million. A huge number that a lot of people don't realize. Evans Memorial, I think they're here in the room. This is, their numbers, again, very similar. Phoebe Sumter, and this is for Freddie Powell Sims, who's not here, Senator Sims, is always interested in her healthcare facilities. We had a number of conversations about that on the floor of the Senate. And again, this is the Phoebe's facility in Sumter County, Americas, which is not too far from Senator Harberson's neighborhood, a little bit south of there. But again, showing the same picture. And then Miller County is another one of Senator Sims. Miller County is unique in Georgia. They have a program where they do respiratory support, ventilator support for patients that are on long-term ventilators. And their facility is, from a financial standpoint, although you can see they still have issues, they're probably in the top tier of stable rural facilities based on their program that they've developed. They actually have patients there from all over the country that can't find a place to serve these patients that are on long-term ventilators. In Mitchell County, again, another facility in Senator Sims's district, and he's got a lot of rural counties, so he's got a lot of rural county hospitals that you can. So that's the end of the program, but I do want to answer questions, and I know this is a CON hearing, and the department is ready to implement whatever the legislature and the governor decides at the end of the day on what needs to happen. We want to make sure you have the facts as it in regarding to the management of CON, which is the Department of Community Health's statutory role. We want to make sure you're making decisions based on good, solid information and ready to partner with y'all in that regard. So be glad to answer questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Burke, and recognize Senator Kirkpatrick.
Thank you so much for trying to simplify a complicated issue. And you may have to dumb it down a little more because I'm an orthopedic surgeon. So when you refer to bad debt, does that include amounts that are not paid by insurance that are billed? So in other words, deductibles, copays, things like that. Is that included in that bad debt?
The bad debt number, and again, I'm not, the expert on the financial side. These folks over here probably can help me with that. But, we know that even if you have the best insurance, there are dollars that the patients are responsible for. So these would be dollars that the patient's responsible for that they're not paying, whether it's copays, deductibles, non-insured, whatever, it all goes in that same bucket.
Okay, and then just to follow up, I've been looking at the GDAC dashboard on charity and indigent care. So now I'm really confused about the uncompensated care. I'm not sure how those definitions all fit, because I don't know if everyone understands the formula, because when I'm looking at it, it's all over the map in terms of what different hospitals are doing. So maybe I should ask the hospitals when it's there.
Well, yeah, and they can speak for themselves, but it is complicated, and all of these formulas are truly can be different. So you have to really dig down to be sure that you're comparing apples to apples, and when you get these numbers. And I think that was a lot of the confusion last year about, not last year, but during the last session, about the uncompensated care being made whole. It is for Medicaid. So Medicaid as a program is generally 70% of Medicare rates. So it's lower because it's supposed to be a safety net. It's not supposed to be as robust a program. But most facilities, and again, some of them are here, will say that they lose a significant amount of money on a Medicaid patient when you add up all of their costs. So even though you're whole on Medicaid, it doesn't mean you're not still losing money. I think is the way to put it. Again, they're better off. I mean, my hospital, I think, gets around $600,000 from DPP, which is, great new money we didn't have before. But $600,000, when you're losing $6 million a year, is, you know what I mean? It's not making you whole. It's it's a benefit. And it's money we didn't have before, but it's not the solution to rural health financial instability. So.
Chairman Watson.
Thank you, Chairman Burke or Dr. Burke. We appreciate that. I still consider you part of the Senate. I know you moved on to the executive branch, but we certainly appreciate what you're doing there. If you could just sort of follow up and give us a definition of what the bad debt is, but help me understand it. So the rural hospitals are made whole from a Medicaid standpoint, and of course Grady and AU and the 22 teaching hospitals. From a Medicaid standpoint, they're all made whole. Because if I remember correctly, Medicaid pays maybe 70% of actually what it is. So now they're being paid at 120% or whatever the commercial rate is. And then Medicare may pay 85% of actual cost or so, but it is the private portion that serves most of the hospitals that makes up for the rest of the indigent care. But that is certainly a windfall, and that bad debt has been there for years. This is a little rambling from that perspective, but there's sort of the second part of the state. If question, other states like Florida and Texas and South Carolina just did away with CON, and some of those don't even have DPP, from what I understand. So I was just wondering the comparison and contrast there.
No, and I think it's, you explained it correctly in that number one, it is very complicated. And the aid and strong programs are much more financially robust and from the standpoint of comparing them to what the rural hospitals are getting. And I think that's what I'm trying to emphasize is you can't paint the hospital industry with one brush, because the financial issues that face rural facilities and mainly it is just patient mix from the standpoint of how much commercial care they have. And generally speaking, most of them have anywhere from 70 to 80% either Medicaid, indigent, or Medicare, and very little 15, 20% commercial. Whereas if you flip that model, if you happen to live in a suburban area of Savannah, or perhaps in Augusta or Atlanta, those hospitals have a much more higher number of commercial patients, and therefore their financial situation is a lot more stable. So I think to the degree that this has anything to do with CON, and I'm not sure it really does, it's a matter of making sure that the committee understands that the program, the DPP program, did not solve all the problems. And where I'm coming from is again, speaking for rural Georgia, because that's one of our responsibilities in the agency is to, we are kind of the people they call when they can't make payroll and say, hey, we need help. And just, wanted you guys to know that DPP does not solve that problem. We still have a lot of facilities that are having trouble with their cash flow, and DPP did not solve their financial worries. Whether that has any influence on your decisions about CON or not, I think each person can decide for themselves. Is that fair?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, if y'all want to let her speak to the bad debt question.
Great.
And even then, I've heard it 10 times. I'm still not sure I understand.
I had to hear it several times too. Yes.
And I'm by no means an expert in this area, and we can follow up. We can help DCH follow up on this. But in general terms, bad debt is when there's an expectation of payment. That means there's some agreement made, there's some insurance, there's an expectation of payment, and then ultimately folks don't pay. On the other side, uncompensated care, indigent care, charity care, there isn't an expectation of payment. So that's just a little bit of a difference there, but we can follow up on the specifics on that. I also wanted to answer the question on Florida and Texas. They actually do have pretty large directed payment programs. They're relatively new, but they do both have I think they're both in the $3 billion range now for Texas and Florida, just to give you a sense.
And our number is about, what's our big number?
1.2 billion.
1.2 compared to 3 billion for each one of them. And neither of those have CON legis. They're CON free states, correct? That is accurate. Texas does not have CON, neither does Florida.
And Florida just got approval for 3.5 billion.
3.5 billion? Yeah, so that's a new program for them. So they're following the lead, and maybe we'll be following their lead. Thank you.
I do have a question for one of the two. I don't know who would be able to best answer this, but of the 55 hospitals who are eligible, I'm more so concerned with net proceeds, not total proceeds, right? Because I think that what Dr. Watson was getting at was this bad debt has been priced into the business model probably for decades, right? And that's an expectation in terms of the financials of doing business as a rural hospital. Has DPP inverted any of that? In other words, do we have hospitals who were losing money who are now making money because of DPP? Do we have hospitals who we think were on the verge of bankruptcy who the 600,000 or whatever the number may be has changed that? Or is essentially the thesis that you're putting forth that this is more so something that has impacted Grady, the teaching hospitals, and the larger urban hospitals much more than it has the rurals?
Yeah, I would say the latter is true. Now, we don't have the final numbers for the Rural Hospital Tax Credit Program to know if any of the ones that are eligible this year have had enough benefit. Whether it's coming from this program, you know, they're all constantly trying to improve their service line, what they're giving to their customers. So it's not like they are not trying to improve their bottom line, whether there's DPP or not. You know what I mean? All of them are trying to find out what can we do tomorrow that we're not doing today to make our business model better. So I think it's important to realize that part changes every year. The number of facilities that are in the black or in the red, it wiggles and wobbles. I mean, it's not the same constantly. I would say that's probably, again, a little different for those hospitals that have better payer mix that are kind of every year they're going to make some money. In the rurals, they're much more sensitive to what might be going on. I mean, if you have a facility that's doing a loss leader and charging almost nothing for MRIs 30 miles away, then that may be the only service that this rural facility is actually making a margin on. All that goes away, and all of a sudden they go from being in the black to being in the red, you know, overnight almost. So I think it's important to realize that we will do the math and we will determine how many of those 55 are continuing to be eligible. But the margin by legislation was 10%. So they have to be over that in their uncompensated care, indigent care. Those three buckets are what we measure. We add them together, and that's the threshold, is that 10% number. And I'm fairly sure if we have any that are moved into the not be eligible for that program, then it'll be just a couple. Won't be like half of them or anything like that. And I know from the traveling I've done in the last 10 years, there are a lot of CEOs that said without the rural hospital tax credit, they'd already would have closed. I mean, that program, I think, saved a number of rural facilities. And it's important to realize that's we bumped the number up. So next year will be a little more money eligible. And that's almost twice as big as the DPP when it comes to actual dollar. So.
Right. Okay.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Going to be difficult not to call you Chairman Burke. Dr. Burke, and this may be a question for some of the folks at Sellers too. Couple of points. For the bad debt and indigent charity care, are we using like the state statutory definition that you all set? For how that's calculated, is the IRS definition or is it billed charges?
I think it's the what's in the statute, because that's where these numbers came from. It's Rural Hospital Tax Credit Program that the folks in Cordeal and the Department of Revenue work together to determine those eligibilities.
Great.
Second question. If I say anything that's not accurate now.
Second question, we have a 5-part, DPP at this point. Are we limited into further approaches if the state wanted to take a look at enhancing this more? I mean, I'm we used to talk about UPL headroom. Is the hospital-specific limit the same concept, or is there more that the state could do?
So the short answer is possibly. So there is a proposed managed care rule in front of CMS right now that is considering capping the size or percentage of directed payments as a percentage of underlying managed care. So right now it's around the upper cap that CMS is considering. So possibly, it depends on what happens with the managed care rule.
And that was my third question is, do you think that there's a risk to CMS looking at this because they have exploded across the country? And
I would say directed payment programs have grown quite exponentially, and what CMS is looking for is really return on investment. So how are patient outcomes improving in the populations that the payments are based on? So in this case, again, in Georgia, it's moms and babies in Medicaid. So they want to see that patient outcomes are improving. So I think the reason why there's annual evaluation and approvals is because CMS wants to see what's happening. Are we moving the needle on some of these outcomes and benchmarks? So potentially.
thanks.
Go ahead.
Quick follow-up question to that. Can you hear me okay? If I understand it correctly, this program, which has evolved and particularly changed as of last year, is it approved on an annual basis from CMS?
Yes.
Okay.
They're depending on the program. And again, that slide that had all the boxes has a little more detail about that. But the program that Grady's eligible for, has a clawback, 10% at risk. So that some of that money can be pulled back if they don't hit the metrics that are defined. But CMS does require, it's one of these new words that I've learned this year, preprint. So we have to send them, what the data shows for each program, and then they have the option of asking questions or saying, sorry, you're not getting what you need out of this, and we're not going to approve it, so it's gone. So it is at risk for each program, though, is measured separately on the merits of that particular program.
So does the bucket of funds, though, overall that you're distributing, does that wax and wane based on what CMS approves?
Yeah, because it's, the formula is based on what they do with that, that CMO managed care volume. So that can change with any facility any given year. So that's the ultimate denominator, is how much Medicaid actually flows through that facility.
Fair enough. The reason for my comment, my question is really just representing hospitals, and many in the audience here is, if we're very grateful for that program. Being a CEO in a rural-based hospital, it has been very helpful and has given us the opportunity to look at different things to ensure that we're looking at our viability, our health, but also programs that are important for the community that we serve, particularly women's and children's labor and delivery. With regards to where we're at Vidalia, the closest labor and delivery center is about 50 minutes in any which direction. And so it's important that we continue to be able to provide those services, and this has been helpful in doing that. I think from a hospital perspective, knowing that this is not a one and done type program, but it's something in perpetuity, is helpful in planning.
Well, I think from the department standpoint, that we have absolutely no interest in doing anything but making it as robust as the federal government will allow us to do. Beyond that, anybody's guess.
I recognize Chairman Watson for one last question, and we're going to the next item.
Sorry, just to follow up, the clawback for Grady and MCG that's a quality metric, isn't that right? And then the clawback from rules is on workforce development, if I remember correctly.
Well, that's the measurement they're being measured against, but it's not. There's no clawback on that one. So it's
just a measurement.
It's either yes or no.
Gotcha.
From the.
And I mean, but isn't that a good thing that the federal government's doing? I mean, requiring quality for this windfall and requiring workforce development. I mean, isn't that sort of what we want to do? I mean, we want to stress
Absolutely.
quality. I mean,
I
that's,
think, you know,
and
that's.
workforce is important too, especially in the rural areas.
As far as where I come from, I think it is very, very important that we shift as much as we can to an outcome-based
So,
reimbursement. So there's no problem from where I sit on
I
those
mean,
issues.
from a
So,
physician or patient standpoint, I would want that to be quality driven and workforce driven. And I mean, I'm not beating up on anybody, but you know, shame on us or them if you can't deliver the quality and the workforce that you're asked to do, because those are both needed in your hospital and in your community. So renewal would be based on what you're actually doing, you know, for your patients.
No, and if we implied anything otherwise, it was not meant to be. It's just that this is different because most plan amendments that we submit are for 5 years. I mean, that's the way CMS normally does. So this particular program is a little different.
It is. It sounds different.
Renew it every year. So
Sounds almost, yeah, I mean, sounds good. Yeah, I mean, that's a good thing. I would certainly not want to hear any complaining about that.
Thank you all for making the trip, and I think each time we hear about this, we learn a little bit more. So it's helpful to see this. Thank you for putting this packet together. I'm going to give this study as well.
we're open for any written questions or anybody that needs any further information. Make sure you just let us know. Thank y'all.
Thank you guys so much. I'm going to recognize Katie Chubb, Augusta Birthing Center next. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Good morning. My name is Katie Chubb, and I'm the founding director of the Augusta Birth Center. No PowerPoint presentation from me. You're just going to have to listen to this British accent. I moved to America with $100 in the pursuit of the American dream in 2009. Maybe not the best year to move here. I opened several successful small businesses, but my eye was always on the prize, to open the most incredible nonprofit birth center in Georgia. I wanted a place that could offer birth, postpartum, annual checkups, women-centered care, mental health, fitness, and nutritional support all under one roof. We could fit anyone's budget. We would take Medicaid and utilize grant writers to make us, Augusta especially, the safest place to give birth in Georgia. Unfortunately, we're unable to open and serve these mothers and mothers-to-be because my con application was not approved. I sat for months and wrote 826 pages. I got over 500 written statements from members of my community, including physicians, nurses, surgeons, politicians, saying that this was so needed for Augusta. I did not fail at the con. In fact, the Department of Community Health said my application was a success, apart from one rule which I was unable to fulfill. I could not obtain a transfer agreement with the local hospitals. They did not want to partner with me because a transfer agreement would stop me from opening. They've stated this publicly through the local commissioner in Augusta, Brandon Garrett, and they've stated it on the con opposition, which is publicly recorded in our file. When we had our opposition statement meeting where the local hospitals joined us and the Department of Community Health on the phone, the hospitals freely and openly admitted with signed documentation that they have not and will not be providing a transfer agreement, effectively exercising a competitor's veto against my nonprofit. You can imagine my surprise when, after several meetings with the formerly named university hospital leadership to determine the terms of our agreement, having their labor and delivery department on board, it was denied outright by the hospital's legal representative. You can imagine my even deeper surprise when just this past week, 2 years later, a lobbyist leveraged a brazen lie to make it look and appear as if we had rejected a transfer agreement, when there were public statements across the board from every hospital on why they would not provide us with one, not only in the con proceedings, but also in press comments when asked for comments to any comments that Augusta Birth Center has made. So why the hospital is threatened by a small family-run business? We're minority-owned, veteran-owned, woman-owned. We have documentation and proof of our hospital communications because, like any good millennial woman, I go through my attorney, and my attorney communicates with the hospitals. Pacific Legal Foundation, which is my legal representing firm, has all the documentations to prove this lobbyist lie is completely false. The revelation suggests that certain elements in the con were potentially manipulated, allowing established entities to exert monopolistic control over the healthcare market in the region, effectively eliminating any competition. Such monopolization is emblematic of antitrust violations where a single entity or coordinated entities stifle competition to dominate a particular sector. Essentially, the con seems to have inadvertently, or perhaps intentionally, granted existing competitors a veto power over new entrants, further solidifying their market position. When we brought these potential antitrust violations to light during our rule waiver submission to the con, our concerns were unfortunately dismissed. This scenario underscores how established entities can exploit regulatory framework like the con to maintain and amplify their market dominance. We have never not wanted to work with the hospitals. In fact, several of the local hospitals based with the OB practices currently sit on my advisory board. Together, we came up with a workable solution for our maternal health and mortality crisis. Our birth center wants to take the low-risk patients, to take the pressure off the overworked OB-GYNs and allow them to focus more on complex cases to direct their attention. ACOG states on their professional documentation that the safest place to give birth is accredited birth centers and hospitals. And they stated this in 2019 and have continued to state it every year since. To this day, there has not been a maternal or fetal death in the state of Georgia at a birth center. I was inspired to move forward with my mission to build the Augusta Birth Center following my labor and delivery at the Atlanta Birth Center. The care I received there was like nothing else I'd experienced in the United States. It's hard to describe the comfort and care that my husband and I experienced contrasted with the cold environment I had at the hospital for my second birth. The staff let me share my opinions. I was taught consent over coercion, and I expressed how I wanted to carry and deliver my baby. Since I began this journey opening the birth center, I've received endless support. Through the Augusta community, whether they are medical professionals, mothers, or mothers-to-be, there's not a single person who said to me, "We don't need this." Our website makes it clear that we're not open. Yet every day, including 5 minutes ago, I receive messages from mothers asking, when are we going to be open? What options are there for birth? Sadly, I have to turn everybody away. Through my current 4 businesses, I'm currently reminded of this great need in Augusta. The solution I ask of this committee is simple, and for the legislator as a whole is straightforward. Remove the con requirements for obstetrical facilities so that I and others may open birth centers to better serve women who feel underserved by their current communities. And yes, I do have a solution for rural healthcare as well to get OBs into those communities. I don't want to be the worst state. I want to be the best. I'm very, very pro-Georgia for someone who immigrated here. We are considered to be a pro-life state, but we have one of the worst maternal mortalities. Without any sort of change, women are going to continue to die. And we've seen that happen this year already. Women want more options and choices. They want consent. They want to be able to voice their opinion. We are currently worse in maternal mortality in Augusta than Syria and Cuba, so we're worse than a third world country at war. Because of the lack of options for birth in our area, I still have to send women to local hospitals despite them opposing me. I know this is the only place for them to give birth besides home birth. But speaking of home birth, because we don't have a viable option for alternative birth, women are traveling to South Carolina to use birth centers because the 3 Georgia locations are too far. And I know this, I drove 2.5 hours in labor. So now not only are we unable to care for women, we're sending women into South Carolina who has since completely reformed their con laws. So that brings profit into South Carolina. On top of this, we now see midwives coming down from South Carolina to Georgia, delivering babies in Georgia and billing in South Carolina. You might not think this is significant, but with hospitals suffering and already closing, how much more can we afford to reject? Another fact that concerns me as a special needs foster parent is the fact that some people are choosing to have unattended home births to avoid hospitals and past trauma. Due to this, they do not register the birth with the state for fear of repercussions, and essentially we're now losing track of children who might need services or support. My case is just one example of where the con needs to be reformed entirely. The law works as a framework to support existing healthcare networks, regardless of their intentions, and to push out competition. When that framework is threatened, the lobby will straight lie to your faces or your representatives to maintain that system. If you want to improve the healthcare in rural communities of Georgia, $1 billion hospital investment into every one of them isn't going to help, as evidenced by the 15 hospitals that have closed in the past few years. What will help is removing the roadblocks in place that keep enterprising local individuals with innate vested interest in improving our home from doing anything about it. Thank you very much for your time, and I welcome any questions you might have, including about the certificate of need procedure itself, because I think there's only 2 of us in this room that have filed one.
Thank you, Ms. Chubb. Any questions or comments from the committee? Dr. Kirkpatrick.
My question is, so the crux of your issue was the transfer agreement with the hospital,
Correct.
but hospitals operate under EMTALA.
Yes.
So they have to take emergency patients, right? So.
Yes, and I did bring that up in my rule waiver through my attorney, and Department of Community Health insisted that their rule was the one that had to be enforced. I understand EMTALA is a federal regulation, and I understand Department of Community Health's regulation was only for Georgia Certificate of Need. In my rule waiver, I actually went above and beyond, in my opinion, to fulfill this transfer agreement. I got a agreement with a maternal fetal medicine who had privileges at 3 hospitals. So I could transfer through her and have a maternal fetal medicine who is incredibly talented look over any patients I need to transfer. And that's better than any transfer agreement that's currently standing. But they still denied that because they said that I had to fulfill the rule as it is written, which is Augusta Birth Center has to be able to transfer to a local hospital directly without using a maternal fetal medicine who would be the doctor caring for any of my transfers. I'd also gave my patients choices of which hospital they wanted to go to instead of just transferring to one hospital.
See no other questions in the committee, Ms. Chubb. Thank you for your testimony. If possible, would you mind providing that in writing so that we can share that with the committee as well? Great, thank you. Next, going to recognize Anna Adams, Georgia Hospital Association.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm Anna Adams with the Georgia Hospital Association, and I'm excited to be here before you today to recommend some changes to streamline and modernize the Certificate of Need process, which we believe will make it easier to get a CON if one is required and remove some of the requirements of CON in some cases. We have, as you all are aware, had a CON created work group. Throughout our membership, we have 19 members who were appointed to this work group. And we brought this before you in our first CON meeting where we talked about the purposes of the group, who all served on it, et cetera. This has been a really robust process where we have looked at CON top to bottom, talked about the different areas that CON impacts. And I'm very excited to talk with you today about the 14 recommendations that we have that impact not just hospitals, but all healthcare providers across the spectrum. We had a total of 12 meetings, and I am pleased to report that at our final meeting, the GHA board unanimously approved these 14 recommendations that we'll go through today. And I have shared with you all a separate document that looks like this. I think you have it printed that goes into more detail on each of these recommendations, talks about the reasoning behind each one and what kind of impact it's going to have. The GHA position currently on Certificate of Need is to streamline and simplify the Certificate of Need process. This is a very different position than we have brought before you in the past. Previously, our statement said to protect the current Certificate of Need process. It no longer says that. At this point, it talks about supporting the state health planning process to ensure access to all healthcare services. That means services that run the gamut from labor and delivery to emergency department services, imaging, surgery, et cetera. We want to make sure that patients have access to every individual type of service, not just an abundance of one service in particular. Our goal in this study group was to focus on access to care while improving quality and safety. What is CON? I think it's important just to kind of highlight what we talked about within the group. It is a community-based health planning process, which was really the focus of a lot of our discussions in ensuring the appropriate allocation of healthcare resources. We don't want one part of the state to have a ton of healthcare services while other parts of the state still have healthcare deserts, especially for specific service areas like labor and delivery. We want to require that, or we want to make sure that the committee members understood that it requires providers to demonstrate a need within their communities. So very much a community-based focus. The current OCGA stated purpose of Certificate of Need talks again about ensuring access and making sure that those are available to all citizens. And then finally, I just wanted to highlight again some of the hallmarks of our discussions within our CON work group: ensuring access to comprehensive services, resource application, promoting charity care, which I know has been a focus for this group, and encouraging public input, facilitating planning and policy, et cetera. So with that, I'll jump into our recommendations. So the general outline of our recommendations is again to encourage policymakers, as you study the Certificate of Need program, that any modifications be considered in the context of the state's entire healthcare system, so not just in a vacuum. Many of the recommendations that we have are complementary to each other and work in concert with one another, but each of them provide greater access to care by streamlining the process, making sure that it is easier to get a CON if one is required. So our recommendations to the regulatory process, there are 4 here that coincide with the larger document that I have. The first being updating the state health planning process at least once every 5 years. Many of the state health plans are 20 years old or more. And so when you think about having to get a certificate of need for certain services, those guidelines are incredibly outdated. So our recommendation is that these be updated through the department at least once every 5 years. This would involve, first and foremost, an update to each of them individually, just to get them up to date. This is going to have an impact on physicians, surgery centers, hospitals, each of the communities individually, so it's not just a hospital benefit. The second here is limiting opposition to in-state entities whose service area substantially overlaps. There was a situation last year where an out-of-state entity opposed a certificate of need application in the state of Georgia. The department, through regulation, disallowed that. We want to make sure that that becomes a part of the statute so that any changes of the department later on don't allow those out-of-state entities to come back in and oppose. The third recommendation on this sheet is eliminating the Certificate of Need Appeals Panel. There have been a lot of discussions over the years about the burdens of the appeal panel, what that looks like, how difficult it can be, and how challenging it is to navigate. So our proposal is to move those administrative hearings to the Office of State Administrative Hearings. It's a much more streamlined process with judges who have staff who are experts in this area, which will eliminate a lot of the headache for many of the applicants. And then finally, limiting the commissioner's review to 30 days. So this really speeds up the calendar for what it takes when you are applying for a certificate of need if there are appeals and oppositions. Our second set of recommendations is pertaining to thresholds. The first is eliminating the capital expenditure threshold for certificate of need. This applies to all provider types for construction-only projects, which means that it would not apply to a brand new service line that requires a CON that you do not already have. However, if you want to do any kind of addition to your facility that is construction only, that expenditure threshold would no longer apply. So you would not be required to get a certificate of need from the state under this recommendation. Further, the second recommendations under threshold is to eliminate the equipment expenditure thresholds. So same premise as the previous threshold recommendation, only it applies to equipment. Again, this applies to hospitals, physicians, freestanding imaging, and there's a little caveat at the bottom that you'll see there related to imaging centers that were grandfathered prior to the 2008 legislative changes. There was a pretty robust certificate of need change in 2008 that carved out some of the imaging centers. This kind of streamlines and makes them all unanimous, or treats them all the same. Perinatal services is one of the recommendation groups that we had probably some of the most robust discussion within our CON work group. And we think that this recommendation is going to have a pretty substantial impact on maternal mortality as you all are discussing solutions in that area. So first and foremost, from a perinatal services perspective, GHA feels that increasing access to pre- and postnatal care in Georgia's maternity care deserts, really across the state, but specifically in those maternity care deserts, is going to have just as much, if not more, of an impact than certificate of need to ensuring that those women in those areas have access to those services. So increased financial support for obstetricians, certified nurse midwives, and family medicine practitioners is an important piece of this recommendation. It's not specifically a certificate of need recommendation, but these all have to work hand in hand in order for any of these CON recommendations to work. We recommend expanding access to telehealth services for maternal care services, and then optimizing scope of practice regulations to maximize access to safe and affordable care for women. The final recommendation in the perinatal services piece is related to tort reform measures that can ensure providers feel safe to practice in these varied settings. GHA has made a couple of recommendations related to tort reform so that these providers do feel safe to go to those rural areas to deliver babies, and those rural areas have the ability to recruit those providers. If those 4 items are addressed, then GHA recommends exempting basic OB services from the certificate of need process. This includes labor and delivery and nurseries that go along with them. That would apply to hospitals, and we would recommend revising the licensure standard to ensure that quality and volume standards are met with the CON exemption. Our next set of recommendations is about new exemptions to the Certificate of Need program. The first is expanding current exemptions to allow closed facilities or service lines to reopen within 24 months. Currently, the Certificate of Need law allows you to reopen within 12 months under your same Certificate of Need. This would double that time frame. The second recommendation is a new exemption to allow health systems to transfer existing beds or services from one hospital or campus to another existing hospital or campus, as long as it's the same service in the same system within a 10-mile radius. That seems really complicated, and there are a lot of caveats there, but it is meant to address patient flow from facility to facility. If one facility is at capacity and another has available beds, and you are within a close proximity, you would be able to have that flexibility to move those beds and services. The third recommendation under exemption is to expand the current exemption to allow existing hospitals to increase their bed capacity by the greater of 10 beds or 20% every 3 years if the hospital has maintained at least a 60% occupancy rate for the previous 12 months. Currently, the percentage is 75%, and it's also a 2-year time frame. What we've done with this is made it easier to add more beds, but we've extended the time frame to reduce some of the burden on the Department of Community Health. We know that the department has a lot of applications, a lot of people coming to them for certificate of need and letters of determination, and so this kind of frees them up to manage some of the responsibilities that they have. And then finally, expanding the current exemption to allow healthcare facilities in urban counties to relocate within 5 miles of the existing facility. In a rural county today, you can relocate a facility anywhere within the borders of the county under your same CON without having to get a new one. This allows urban counties to do it within 5 miles. They can currently do it, although not all the way to 5 miles. Another area the group spent a lot of time discussing is psychiatric and substance abuse services. We maybe spent an entire meeting going through all of the various challenges related to psych and substance abuse, and not just for the hospitals who offer psych services, but for those who have emergency departments and see those patients in their ED setting. And so because of the robust and very complicated nature of how we offer psych services in the state of Georgia, we are recommending that any changes to psychiatric and substance abuse services be treated separately from the final certificate of need recommendations because they are so complicated. Psych right now is overseen in a dual capacity by both the Department of Community Health and the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities, depending on the facility type. And there are very robust challenges with how those services are being offered and what the hospitals are facing with regard to those patients and making sure that they have access to those services. So first and foremost, the recommendation is to expand access to crisis services to stabilize the behavioral health safety net. Under the Department of Community Health category in their responsibility, the recommendation is equitable access to services in Medicaid fee-for-service and managed care programs because they are treated separately. Enhancing Medicaid payments to fully cover the cost of care That includes patients who are sitting in an emergency department setting waiting for bed placement in a private facility or in a state-owned facility, and creating a new Medicaid directed payment program, as you all discussed earlier with Dr. Burke, for psychiatric hospitals that are private. Under the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities section, we're going to recommend creating sufficient safety net capacity for crisis services to serve the needs of all publicly insured and uninsured behavioral health patients. These are the patients that often board for extended periods of time in hospital emergency departments without access to those psych services. Enhancing payments for state contracted inpatient psych beds to fully cover the cost of care, and establishing a direct funding mechanism to reimburse hospitals for the cost of boarding behavioral health patients in the emergency department and transporting patients to emergency receiving facilities. Once the behavioral health safety net is stabilized, GHA will recommend a new exemption for inpatient psychiatric and substance abuse beds, provided that those new or expanded beds be included in the DVHDD inventory to treat uninsured behavioral health patients in crisis, which means that if you were to get a certificate of need exemption for those new behavioral health beds, the state include those beds as an option for patients who are uninsured to be able to be transferred to while the state pays for those services in those beds. And then our final recommendation is related to the statutory organization. The statute has been updated multiple times since it was put into place, and it has at this point become very complicated. It's cumbersome. You've heard from a lot of people testifying, and I think there's a lot of confusion about what the certificate of need law entails, how to navigate it. And so our recommendation is to completely update Chapter 6 of Title 31 to streamline the statute, make it easier to understand and easier to follow. We feel that providers at this point may not apply for certificate of need because of the confusion in the statute. And if you don't have an attorney on staff who can help you navigate that process, it's incredibly cumbersome. And so we feel that rewriting the statute will really help with some of that confusion. So that completes our recommendations, and I am happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Adams. I recognize Chairman Harbison.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Under your exemptions and recommendations, the closed facilities part of it, for instance, in Montezuma, Georgia, that facility closed, a regular hospital closed, and now serves psychiatric patients. This would theoretically give them a chance to reopen if they so desired under your first exemption point within 24 months if they so desire to do so. Is that right?
If a service line has been closed for 24 months or fewer, this recommendation would allow them to reopen without going through the same certificate of need process for the same service line. So for example, if there were a hospital who in a rural area happened to close their labor and delivery unit and it had been 36 months, labor and delivery is not a great example because we're recommending an exemption for that, but psych services. Then after the 24 period, you would have to reapply.
I see.
However, we've recommended so many changes throughout to who can oppose a certificate of need, making it more difficult to oppose, eliminating the ability to oppose, that it really kind of works hand in hand. You would theoretically be able to apply, no one would oppose, and you would move forward.
And secondly, if I may, Mr. Chairman, that 10-mile radius would be dropped from 35 to 10. That's your recommendation on your second bullet point. Transfer existing beds from one hospital to campus, et cetera, and within a 10-mile radius of the original location. Is that currently 35 miles or?
It's not. Right now, there is no allowance to transfer beds from one facility to another. I think what you're referring to is the ability to oppose, which is the 35-mile radius. So our proposal is to keep the 35 miles radius for the ability to oppose, but then adding to that a substantially overlaps rule, meaning that 10% of the existing facility's patient population would have to be impacted by a new facility coming into that area. It's currently the threshold that the department uses for adverse impact anyway, and so we're kind of backing it up a step so that instead of getting it to the department level, having the department determine that there'll be an adverse impact, we're going to prevent you from opposing altogether.
And if you said this finally, I apologize, but under your psychiatric and substance abuse services, the second point, enhanced Medicaid payments to full coverage of cost of care, is that a federal directed payment or is it state?
This is a state payment to make
Okay.
sure that when you are a Medicaid patient and you're receiving those psychiatric services, if you are admitted to a facility, the payment that you receive through the Medicaid program at least covers what it costs you to provide that care.
Thank you.
Dr. Kirkpatrick.
Yeah. Thank you for your presentation. I appreciate you all working on this for months.
Thank you.
One of the questions that I had is the exemptions and the getting rid of the thresholds for equipment and things like that. Is that only for existing facilities, or would that also apply to new facilities?
If a new facility were to come into the state, these same threshold exemptions would apply to them, as long as it is number one, for the capital expenditure threshold, it would be a construction-only project. And then number two, eliminating the equipment expenditure thresholds. Once you are established as a facility, this same threshold exemption would apply after you are established.
But if you're a new facility,
If you're a new facility, you would be subject to certificate of need as long as you are currently already subject to certificate of need. So for example, if you wanted to build a new hospital, you would still have to go through the certificate of need process to build a new hospital. However, we have changed who all can oppose to that, so that process should be easier. But then once you are established, these would all apply.
okay, and then, Mr. Chairman, I have one more. I don't know if you guys had any conversation about this, but when physician practices are bought by hospitals, many times there's a facility fee that is then attached to the services. And that, I don't know if that varies, whether it's on campus or off campus. I know some states have addressed that with facility fees only for on-campus services. And I just wondered if you all had had that conversation.
We did not have that conversation as it pertains specifically to certificate of need. However, we do have that conversation regularly, especially when it comes to the federal regulations related to hospital outpatient departments and whether or not they are reimbursed. We call that site neutral. We're actually doing a lot of lobbying work right now at the federal level to ensure that the payment is the same regardless of whether the site is at the hospital or off campus. We want to ensure that physicians and providers, if they are providing that same service, are reimbursed in the same way.
So are you saying that you guys are supporting getting rid of the site of service differential?
I'm not sure I'm following your question.
Well, there's a differential between site of service for a physician's office versus a hospital. And I hadn't heard anyone from the hospital business say that they would support getting rid of that differential. So the facility fee comes into play if the service is provided at an on-campus facility versus off-campus. I just wasn't clear where you guys were on that.
We do support the facility fee if it is a hospital-based setting because it does cost more to operate those facilities. If a hospital, though, is purchasing a physician practice, we don't consider that a part of the certificate of need argument, but we're happy to talk more about that.
Okay, thank you.
Recognize Jesse.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. On the recommendation around the updating of the state health plan, would that just be the department staff, or does that include some sort of reconstituted health strategies advisory council or anything like that?
The department already has the ability to do that. They just have to reconstitute those technical advisory committees, which would address each of the service-specific rules that we have here, could streamline those. Theoretically could make it a lot easier to get through the certificate of need process, make sure that it's modernized.
And a follow-up question, for some of these funding enhancements, particularly for the public patients, have y'all gotten any financial estimates on kind of what that would look like, even ballpark? Or?
I do not, but I can tell you from a facility by facility perspective, those hospitals know what their costs are to treat those patients, and so we could certainly add that up.
Chairman Watson.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for presenting to us. From my perspective, I mean, we certainly have done a fair amount of legislation relating to mental health and substance abuse and behavioral health. And don't get me wrong, I think that's been very important and it's been vastly underfunded. But I do take a little issue with the singling out mental health as being, I think it says, create a new Medicaid direct payment for private psychiatric hospitals and enhance Medicaid payments to fully cover the cost of care. I mean, goodness gracious, I mean, I think Medicaid payments should fully fund the cost of care, and for us not to be, increasing, that funding, if we're only funding 70% of the cost, then that's just not really fair. Of course, DPB does help out with that. I get that, and it's helped the rural hospitals a lot. I got it. But we should be increasing reimbursement, whether that's for providers or hospitals from that perspective. So let me applaud you for asking for that, but I wouldn't single out psychiatric and substance abuse. I'd say for all levels of care. Going with the exemptions, though, I mean, why do we really care whether we have someone wants to put up a new hospital or add more beds?
The addition of a new hospital within a community, while in many cases is very beneficial to those community members, we want to make sure that they have access to those care services. We also want to ensure that there's not an adverse enough impact to existing facilities so that certain services within the community that the new facility may not be offering would be eliminated.
That's sort of monopolistic and anti-competitive, right? So you have a new hospital versus an old hospital, and yet you want to protect that from a governmental standpoint. I mean, Texas and Florida don't have that, and I think they're doing pretty well for their health care, and South Carolina just did away with it. Why does the government want to be involved in regulating something like that?
I think if there's a need within the community, it shouldn't be a challenge. It shouldn't be an issue.
Yeah, but that's the issue, is that I presume the folks that are doing the new hospital, they've done the numbers, and they're maybe investors, or maybe it's another governmental entity that's doing that. I would hope they wouldn't put something in there if it's not a need. I mean, competition makes us all healthier. So I'm just struggling with the why the governmental regulation here.
We just want to ensure that we're protecting those services that are sole services.
But by regulations, they'll have to do those services too, or they'll have to be, or that other entity may have to subspecialize, but they will all have to adapt. But that's part of what happens in Florida and Texas and all the other states that don't have CON.
We have had conversations with the hospital associations in each of those respective states, and we did consider a lot of their feedback and discussed it with our certificate of need work group. Robust discussions about Florida, Texas, got recommendations from them on things to make sure that we included, one of which is included in our perinatal services recommendation about the licensure standards. We want to ensure that we do still have access to all the services, not just an abundance of one service. I think if a new facility wants to come into an area of the state where a facility already exists, if there is a need within that community, they shouldn't have an issue through the Department of Community Health.
I mean, that's the question, is us government folks or executive branches or bureaucrats are making the decision whether there's a need or not. I mean, that's not what's happening elsewhere. And that's sort of what we're bureaucratically doing.
I do think that our recommendations address a lot of that, whether or not there is a need. We're preventing people from opposing on the front end.
I mean, it's interestingly, the feedback I'm getting from Florida and Texas is they don't have CON.
They do not. You're right. They do not.
I mean, that's the feedback they're getting, that I'm hearing.
They don't have certificate of need, although I don't know that they have addressed, through the absence of certificate of need, all of the challenges that we're trying to address here in Georgia, which is why
Wow.
our,
I mean, Texas and Florida, I mean, they're pretty huge. They have very similar demographics at times.
They
But
do.
I get it. Listen, I appreciate it. I mean, I'm glad to see the difference in GHA, your recommendations of what was different in 2023 and what's different in 2024. Thank you. I appreciate that.
absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Watson. I did have a couple of questions, Ms. Adams. We've heard different pieces of testimony from people who have struggled opening facilities in the state of Georgia. We heard one just before you testified. Could you pick one or two of those and maybe highlight how you would see the outcome of that process being different if we adopted every single one of the recommendations that was here?
Thank you for that question. I know you've heard testimony over the last several meetings from people, some of which are referring back to CON law and statute prior to major CON revisions, so prior to 2008, prior to 2019. I think we have made incremental changes to the law over the years, and that gets back to our final recommendation related to the way that the statute is organized. I think there are still a lot of people trying to navigate this process who don't understand the statute, find it impossible to understand, impossible to navigate. And so our hope is that by streamlining the statute itself, we can address some of those concerns. We do have an exemption, for example, for single specialty surgery centers in the state of Georgia. They are not subject to certificate of need. As far as the perinatal services requirement is concerned, one thing that I do want to make sure that the committee understands and that we're thinking about is that certificate of need is one set of requirements and recommendations when it comes to building a new facility in the state of Georgia. But there is also a completely separate set of requirements under the licensure part of each new organization. And so while there may be requirements in certificate of need, eliminating that certificate of need does not address those same requirements existing in licensure. And those requirements within licensure exist for patient safety to ensure that certain volume standards are met, because you want to see the physician who's done this 1,000 times, not the one who does it once a month. That's a quality and safety issue. And so again, certificate of need is one thing we're addressing. There are still other ways we can impact access to care. And I think certificate of need sometimes gets blamed for a lot of the challenges throughout the process. We're trying to streamline those concerns. We've baked into these recommendations some changes in those other areas to impact access, but I do think adopting these will have a really large impact on patient access to care. It's going to streamline the process in the way that the Department of Community Health is going to have less of a burden in this process, because we're eliminating people who can oppose. We're eliminating the need for certificate of need in a lot of situations and kind of creating an easier to navigate, the rules apply to everyone type of environment.
Thank you. From my perspective, what I've heard the most of is we've seen the boxes of, hey, here's the size of my file for certificate of needs. There definitely has been conversation around that. But I think that people are willing to deal with that if the outcome is that they're able to expand, open a facility, do what it is they're wanting to do. I don't think they'd be sitting at that table and testifying and showing us the size of the file if at the end of the day they had gotten their certificate of need.
Mm-hmm.
So my question still remains is what, I think you've been at all of our meetings, and maybe we can talk about the person who testified previously specifically. What would be a different outcome that we would see? Because the expansion things I'm hearing, that's all for people that are currently covered in their CON. And I'm specifically looking for the recommendations that may change outcomes for people who do not currently have a certificate of need. They're going through the process, that their experience will be different and that they will end up not standing at a podium someday telling us that they were not able to do something that they endeavored to do in the healthcare space.
So we are not, in full disclosure, recommending getting rid of the certificate of need process altogether. I do think that there are a lot of merits to the program. It does provide safety for those services in which facilities are losing money. We want to make sure we keep those. Emergency department services is a great example. Hospitals are subject to EMTALA, meaning they have to treat patients regardless of their ability to pay, and they do take a loss for those services. We want to ensure that the communities still have access to those emergency services. I think, having an emergency department within your community brings new business to the area, ensures patients feel safe to live there, work there, play there. I think for somebody who doesn't currently have a certificate of need but wants to come into the state of Georgia, these recommendations can give them peace of mind that they'll be able to apply and go through the process. It will be fast, it will be fair, and there will be fewer people who can oppose them and make that process more difficult. I think for some of the areas where we get a lot of pushback, people who have concerns, for example, perinatal services, opening up perinatal services to certificate of need so that you can offer that service within your hospital, and just instead go through the licensure process, ensure that safety is happening there. That's going to streamline the process, hopefully bring services to rural areas. But again, that recommendation includes recommendations related to tort reform so that our providers feel safe to practice. And that has to go hand in hand with what this recommendation looks like. If you don't have providers within your rural areas, it doesn't matter if your hospital offers labor and delivery services because there's no provider to deliver in that location. So we want to draw providers to those areas. As far as the capital and equipment expenditure thresholds exemptions, there are hospitals that perhaps have a little bit of capital that want to add on to their facility, but maybe don't want to do it because construction prices continue to rise and they don't want to go through the certificate of need process because it's arduous. This gets rid of that. For hospitals that want to replace equipment, this ensures that they can get the most up-to-date equipment or add to their equipment inventory if they already have a certificate of need, so that you're offering that service to the community, and it's state-of-the-art and it's cutting edge. And so we do think that this eliminates a lot of the things that people stand up and complain about and people have headaches about, because of the way that it streamlines. Now, granted, we recognize that these are recommendations. This is a starting point. There may be others who come with ideas. Have you thought about this? And we're happy to consider that. We want to be at the table for those discussions and hear those people out.
Thank you. Can you provide for us, I know you and I talked offline about some of this, but not now, but at some point in the future, specifics around the tort reform measures that you all are talking about. I think bifurcation is one of those that you guys have talked about. I think that for me, if we go through all of this and the net is that people merely get their rejection faster, I don't think that that's a win. But that the hospitals now, and I recognize you're advocating for the hospitals, but that the hospitals have the ability to expand faster, buy new equipment and stuff like that. But for those looking to enter the space, to maybe even be disruptors in the space, to innovate within the space, to have a dream of operating a medical facility, even if they're not going to be disruptors or innovators, I think that we have to think about them. So I would encourage you, maybe if you give some feedback to the committee, I think we need to move the needle a little bit more, such that the net for new providers is not just that we have them get their rejection faster. Because we have heard a lot of stories, I think, and I want to be clear, I'll ask you the specific, I want to make sure I understand this correctly, as it relates to the previous testimony from Ms. Chubb. Since she would not be operating in a hospital, this new perinatal exemption that you're proposing would not apply to her or people who are endeavoring to do these labor and delivery birthing centers that she's talking about.
It would not. It is my understanding in that particular situation that the challenge here is a transfer agreement between a hospital and that facility. Transfer agreements are executed regularly. Many facilities have transfer agreements with more than one hospital at a time. That's standard practice. That's a patient safety and quality requirement. While that is a requirement within certificate of need, again, it is also a requirement of licensure. And so certificate of need aside, that transfer agreement requirement still exists in order for that facility to be licensed. For hospitals to not to not have that existing transfer agreement with a facility, they typically have a set of standards, safety standards in particular, that have to be met. And so it's possible something along that line of taking things off was not satisfied. I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with this exact situation, but we do in all of this still want to make sure that we maintain patient safety.
Is there a compulsory requirement, though, as you understand, to provide a transfer agreement if the licensure requirements are met? Or is that essentially a quasi tool in the tool belt of hospitals to ensure that there is no competition that enters their...
Hospitals know that in that situation, if there is an emergency, they're going to get the patient anyway. They're going to come through ambulance. They're going to come by a car. The purpose of the transfer agreement is to make sure that the patient is pre-registered at the facility so that when they come in, we know what you're allergic to. We know your approximate due date. We know if the baby is potentially high risk. All of those various things make for a safer patient experience should they need to come to the hospital setting.
But
So
if
not
if I'm a
about-
hospital, am I compelled by statute, if they check the boxes on the licensure piece, am I compelled to provide that? Or do I have the ability of my own will for any reason to say I'm not going to provide that?
Usually, if they choose not to provide the transfer agreement, there's a reason. It's not, we just don't want that competition. There are a lot of birth.
But there is nothing in current code that compels them to provide that if all the legal boxes are checked under the licensure.
Not to my knowledge.
Okay, thank you. Are there any questions or comments from the committee? Dr. Kirkpatrick?
One of the things that I brought up at a previous meeting was, in my district, there are many big hospital systems, and frequently they're in litigation with each other over, and you're representing all of them, sorry for you, but would anything in here help that? The part about moving the administrative hearings or something like that, is that what that's in there for?
So that will certainly make the process faster. Right now, through the appeals panel process, the judges that staff that are not experts in CON. They are overworked. They don't have staff access to help them do research. And so the process gets dragged out. Going through the Office of Administrative Appeals makes it so that you have judges who are experts, who know this process, can do it quickly, are not asking for extensions. You hear a lot about people who say this took years and it just kept getting added on to. We think this will stop that. That was not necessarily because of hospital versus hospital. In fact, when we did our certificate of need work group and we looked at who is opposing who, it was surprising the number of appeals and opposition that were not hospital versus hospital. But regardless, we do think that that streamlines the process in a way that people feel more comfortable using it and are more prone to initiate the process because they don't have to worry about that headache.
So just to follow up on the chairman's point, it would likely just speed the process up and bring more expertise, but it wouldn't limit that type of inter-system litigation.
Some of our other recommendations would limit that inter-system litigation, specifically related to the overlapping service area, getting rid of the need for a certificate of need altogether for capital and equipment expenditure. You don't even have to get one anymore, so that stops some of that facility to facility fighting should it exist. But that one alone does not fix it, but we think in conjunction with some of the other recommendations, it does.
Recognize Matt.
Yeah, just one follow-up.
I'm gonna come to Matt first if that's okay. Sure.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a little bit of a clarification with regards to the exemptions. When with respect to current exemption to allow existing hospitals to increase bed capacity, curious, I know in the past it's been 10%, moving to 20%. Any specific reasoning why the increase or not just removing that altogether?
We talked about both with the CON work group, and I think this is where the group was most comfortable expanding to. We think it allows hospitals to add beds faster should they need to. If the community is growing, there's a need for additional inpatient beds, ICU beds. We want to make sure, though, that we are still doing that in a way that the state knows it's happening and is aware, and other hospitals know that it's happening and aware. And so this creates kind of that notification without it going too far.
And then just a follow-up to that. So with regards to who can contest, would it allow for facilities to contest services that they don't necessarily offer?
No. The current certificate of need statute says that you must offer the same service in order to oppose a certificate of need. So this doesn't change that. That's still the case. What we've done is add to that. Right now, you have to offer the same service. You have to be within 35 miles. We are adding to that the proposed new facility or service has to impact at least 10% of your patient volume. So we're making it, again, one step further, even harder for you to oppose.
Thank you.
Chairman Watson.
I'll be happy to defer to others if they have questions. I don't mean to do that. Just a couple of things. When we're talking about access, I mean, it goes both ways. I mean, a lot of hospitals have opposed, NICUs, neonatal ICUs, pediatric ICUs, pediatric beds, emergency room pediatric beds. I just have a tough time swallowing that. I really do. That's sort of difficult for me to understand. And that's sort of up close and personal here in Savannah. Access, again, the freestanding ERs that continually get opposed. And I'm getting back to monopolies and anti-competitive thoughts. And that's just maybe a comment relating to access. And then we'll circle back and give you a compliment in just a minute. The quality that we're talking about, rules and regulations and approval by the feds, CMS, this is not related to CON, right?
Correct.
Right. So from a quality and rules and regulations and approval by the state for any kind of facility, goes through rigorous checks. And not to mention, Jesse Wetherington's organization when it comes to insurance. To get paid, you have to meet all of their parameters also. One of the most positive things that's come out of CMS has been their quality metrics, mainly with primary care, but also hospitals, which are lagging behind, unfortunately. But I would hope they embrace that, because what we're here for are our constituents and our patients, because that's what the bottom line should be. So I want to compliment you from a perspective that the governor, Kemp, has weighed in on relating to car insurance and the price of car insurance and tort reform, tort relief, because that certainly plays a role in healthcare and driving up the cost of healthcare. It doesn't necessarily improve the quality of healthcare. So what CMS is doing from a quality standpoint, whether it's with the directed payment plan or through ACOs, et cetera, that is a very positive move in the direction. I'm glad to see GHA weighing in, hopefully heavily, when it comes to tort reform and tort relief, and that is much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you. We want to make sure, as I mentioned, that providers feel safe to practice, and those are not always hospital-based providers, but we do work closely with providers within their respective communities, and we recognize that as a hospital, we're providing the location for those services, but we rely on those providers to provide that care, and it very much is a partnership, and so we are here to be supportive in a very vocal way on some tort reform measures to make sure that they feel safe.
Thank you, Ms. Adams. I want to thank you and your team for the work that you've done. I know you have a couple members of your team here, as well as to the committee. So if you could, on behalf of our committee, thank your committee for bringing these recommendations forward, and we will certainly continue to read through them, ask you any questions that we have, and hopefully keep the open dialogue going through this process. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Next, and our last speaker before we get to public testimony is Byron. I don't want to butcher your last name. I'm not sure if it's Colley or Coley. Is Byron here? Byron, you can step right down here to the podium. Did I get it right? I got one of the two. Is it Colley or Coley? Coley? Colley. I guessed wrong. You might need to, you can probably walk right behind us here. Good morning. Thanks for being with us, and the floor is yours for 10 minutes.
Good morning. My name is Byron Colley. I'm a native Savanian. I want to say thank you for being here today and all that you do under the Gold Dome for the citizens of our great state. Your decisions change lives. I've practiced pediatric dentistry at Dentistry for Children here in Savannah for 22 years. Our practice has been in existence since 1950. As pediatric dentists, our groups represent a wide catchment of area of Georgia's southeast region, serving Camden, Glenn, McIntosh, Long, Liberty, Bryan, Chatham, Brantley, Wayne, Effingham, Bullock, as well as other states like South Carolina. Because we have a patient-focused practice, we have a compassionate staff, we've never stopped taking new patients, we get patients out of pain, we offer the operating room for dental treatment, and we accept all types of payments, private pay, insurance, and all government-assisted programs. Access to safe and equitable anesthesia services is vital to the practice of restoring oral health to children and is unquestionably recognized as the only safe and compassionate means of providing invasive procedures to young and fragile children. Many dental patients in our region will routinely wait 6 months or longer for treatment under general anesthesia. Pain management, antibiotics, and temporary Band-Aid-like approaches are the only options. Misuse of antibiotics and narcotics in the pediatric population is well documented and against the best practices guidelines of the American Academy of Pediatric Dentists and American Academy of Pediatricians. Despite being commonplace, these practices are neither equitable nor fair. Pediatric dentists have been long-standing members of the surgery departments of our local hospitals for decades, providing care to young children, adults, and children with special health care needs in accordance with the guidelines from the American Academy of Pediatrics and the American Academy of Pediatric Dentistry. The American Academy of Pediatric Dentistry has witnessed a major decrease in operating room access over the last decade, a problem which began as hospitals faced hard financial decisions and set different financial priorities. We are a privately owned practice. We see children who have severe dental needs and patients with a variety of medical conditions. Once the child is being diagnosed with multiple cavities in our office, we discuss with the parents how they would like us to treat their child's dental needs. We have options depending on the child's age, parent's decision, and type of insurance they have. We have the use of nitrous oxide for the cooperative patient who is old enough to understand what we are doing but is still anxious. We can use a papoose, which is a restraint for young children that does not understand what we are doing, is understandably uncooperative. Unfortunately, because of the hospital cost or the wait time for the operating room at the hospital, many families choose this even though they would rather their child be put to sleep in the operating room for dental procedures. We also provide general anesthesia in the operating room. Parents often prefer the operating room option because it allows us to address all the problems while their child is asleep. Is amnesic, a thorough treatment plan can be performed with x-rays. The child will have all their treatment done at one time without having to be placed in a papoose restraint multiple times for dental treatment. Treatment in the operating room also allows all the dental treatment to be completed in one appointment instead of multiple appointments, which allows the child to miss less school, have pain relief immediately, and the parent to miss less work. One treatment visit is typically less traumatic for the child also. For this reason, access to operating rooms is critical for our patients. But there's a critical shortage in operating room access in Savannah and across Georgia. Let me show you a few pictures of what we do in the operating room. This is multiple decayed teeth, which I've prepared. These are the teeth prepared for crowns. As you walk through, you'll see multiple decayed teeth through here. And then you'll see the restored teeth. Our practice has explored opening a multi-specialty surgery center in the past. I know the conversation of multi-specialty surgery center is controversial. However, it'd be good for the patients in our area, especially for access to care. Therefore, I've decided to testify publicly, and I trust that because I have a difference of opinion from others in our community, there will not be any negative recourse towards my practice and the patients I serve. Instead, I hope there will be healthy dialogue to increase access to care for our patients. Because we're now allowed to open our own surgery center, our practice sees patients in the operating room under general anesthesia at St. Joseph Candler here in Savannah. I have great respect for Paul Hinchley and Kyle McCann and their team at St. Joseph Candler. They've taken the time to bring in a consultant group to streamline the operating room to make things more efficient. Unfortunately, we were not involved in the streamlining process and were told afterwards that after 20 years of seeing patients in the hospital, our block time in the operating room was going to be limited. We would also need to change locations to start seeing patients in their surgery center. Once we found out, we met with Mr. Hinchley and Mr. McCann and asked them if they would consider a joint venture with our practice in one other specialty surgery center. And one other specialty in a surgery center, excuse me. Their response was this was not in the hospital's strategic plan, which I understand. However, why should this limit my ability to have a fully functioning multi-specialty surgery center to provide complete access to our patients? The ideal solution of restoring OR access as it was a decade ago is unrealistic and not sustainable, with the increasing pressures of decreasing reimbursement schedules and barriers to care. Hospitals are charged with providing care on a vast continuum of health needs, and a hierarchy of services may view oral health and dental treatment as low priority, and an ambulatory service better suited outside the hospital setting. In competition between dental care and general surgery and other medical specialty services in a community, dental care seldom wins. This may be because of the misperception of the value of oral health by decision makers, or the need by hospitals to nurture a full range of surgical services. This often means commitment of operating room time to non-dental surgery over dentistry. Dental-specific ambulatory surgery centers provide the answer to this complex problem, providing equitable access with significantly lower costs. However, certificate of need laws were not written for dental-specific care and provide no provisions for single specialty dental sites. Moreover, many other states have recognized the value and provide pathways for this common sense solution. More importantly, these sites provide safety and honors the code Prem non nocere. In other words, our patients are at the complete mercy of the hospital. Only the hospital decides when or if or where I can treat my patients. As a result, the current wait time for our surgery for my patients is 7 to 8 months. This is extremely harmful to my patients because routine dental treatment can result in abscessed tooth leading to an extraction, which is what you see here. On one side, the tooth is not abscessed yet, but on the other side, it has to be removed because of the wait time for dental treatment. Imagine telling a parent of a child that is in pain that they'll have to wait 7 to 8 months to resolve their dental problems. If we were able to open our own surgery center, we could also provide these surgeons at a lower cost, making procedures more accessible. Again, I've heard the argument that hospitals are afraid of losing patients with private surgery centers open. But there are two reasons you should not be concerned with that. First, when more facilities open, more patients start seeking treatment. The argument that the hospitals will lose patients assumes there's a fixed number of patients and everyone is already getting services they need. But we know that isn't true. Patients skip needed treatment all the time because they can't afford or can't access care. Second, states that have already repealed certificate of need laws have more hospitals and more surgery centers per capita. This shows that when surgery centers open, they don't push hospitals out of business, just the opposite. More hospitals open and the patients are winners because they have access to more care. I know that South Carolina repealed its certificate of need laws this year, and I'm guessing some of my patients here in Savannah may leave Georgia for treatment in South Carolina if services become more readily available. Keeping certificate of need in place puts Georgia at a competitive disadvantage and harms patients who are forced to wait long and pay too much for care. Studies also show that there are 30% fewer rural hospitals in states with CON laws and 14% fewer rural surgery centers. I would ask the committee to recommend repealing CON because CON decreases access for all types of health care. Thank you.
Any questions from the committee?
Just one.
Yes, Matt.
Do you have thank you for your testimony and quick question. Do you have the ability under the current CON regulations to open a single specialty to provide those services?
I think you answered that question. We do. It does have come with some opposition.
Okay. Could you expand on that? When you say
I think the
opposition?
hospital would oppose us doing that for our own single specialty service center. So it may take away from what they think is service they may be able to provide in their own hospital.
Okay. Thank you.
Chairman Watson.
Yeah, I don't quite understand that. You said your patients with tooth issues or cavities or developing abscesses, you're 7 to 8 month wait. That's what you're saying?
Yes, sir. So if a child comes in today and the parent decides they want their child to be seen in the hospital, currently our wait time is 7 to 8 months then to be seen. And so what happens is normally we like to see children every 6 months to get their teeth cleaned, have x-rays like most of us do at our dental visits. Most of the time that dental treatment gets worse between now and that 6-month checkup, or a tooth becomes infected and has to be removed because we couldn't do the treatment earlier. Parents then choose for their child to be put in a papoose or a restraint instead of being able to go to the hospital to be put to sleep for the dental procedure. I think what this leads to is also kind of going outside the guidelines of the American Academy of Pediatrics, is people end up sedating or doing general anesthesia in their offices instead of in the hospital, in an environment or in a surgery center that's run by anesthesiologists, those who provide general anesthesia as a profession.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Colley, for your testimony. Thank you for what you do. I had a child of mine in a chair with that thing around their nose just a few weeks ago. So certainly grateful for the work you do for the children. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We're going to move on to the public testimony portion. Keenan is... Okay. Mr. Colley, if you could, or Ms. Colley, if you could come back down. Senator Sims has a question for you. And are we able to recognize her, or do we need to read her question? You got it? Oh, did she send her question or no? We will stand by if Senator Sims still is able to join us. If you don't mind actually sitting maybe closer to the podium, and we'll recognize her if she enters the room again. In the meantime, is Roland online and available for public testimony? We'll go to him first. And for all of those doing public testimony today, we'll have 5 minutes for each of you, and the committee will be able to answer questions if they desire. And Roland, the floor is yours. Go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Roland Boehm, and I volunteer and serve on the board of the Georgia chapter of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. I am also a co-founder of the Georgia Mental Health Policy Partnership. As you know, in Georgia, nearly 50 different facilities and services require a certificate of need before they can open. They include freestanding emergency departments, mental health services, and obstetrical facilities, which include birth centers. I'm testifying today to encourage reform of the con law to allow for the establishment and operation of rural healthcare clusters consisting of freestanding emergency departments and empath units, which I will define later in my remarks. These healthcare clusters will put needed care much closer to Georgians in rural communities. While the prevalence of mental illness in rural and metropolitan areas is generally similar, there are differences. For example, the suicide rate is nearly twice as great in the most rural areas of the U.S. compared to the most urban areas. Georgians living in rural areas need to travel much farther than Georgians in rural areas to access both physical and mental emergency care. Hospital closures result in even longer distance and geographical obstacles to overcome, significantly affecting response and transport times. This is a persistent problem that requires innovative approaches to resolve. One innovative approach is to combine freestanding emergency departments with empath units. empath is the acronym for Emergency Psychiatric Assessment, Treatment, and Healing. Empath units are physical environments designed for acute psychiatric patients to receive assessment and treatment and to begin the process of healing. Empath units have been recognized and recommended by the Joint Commission and the National Council for Behavioral Health. In fact, earlier this summer, South Carolina concluded a grant program in which it used $35 million to authorize the construction of 13 empath units across the state. Complementing the emergency department, empath units provide a calm and comforting environment for patients, allowing movement and, more importantly, human interaction that is vital in the first 24 hours of treatment. Empath units streamline emergency department assessment of the health needs of mental health consumers and quickly transitions them out of emergency departments into a calming space that allows for the rapid assessment, supportive behavioral health needs, and linkages to other services. Empath units prevent unnecessary ED and hospital admission, provide more compassionate care, improve ED throughput, and increase patient and provider satisfaction. Critical point is that 75% of patients treated in an empath unit stabilize and return home within 24 hours without costly inpatient admissions or emergency department boarding. Creating a regional health cluster of EDs and empath units puts needed health care much closer to Georgians in rural areas. The clusters also ensure that emergency transport, including Sheriff's Department vehicles, do not find themselves on multiple-hour round trips to transport patients to hospitals, during which time their community is left without emergency and Sheriff Department resources. These regional health clusters will enable complementary health services, including birth centers. The maternal mortality for 2021 was 32.9 deaths per 100,000 live births. Further, suicide is the second leading cause of death for women in the postpartum period, accounting for 1 in 5 deaths during the first year after birth. Over the past 40 years, the number of birth centers in the United States has grown to more than 400 as of 2021, including 91 in Texas and 31 in Florida. Currently, there are 3 birth centers in Georgia, a state with over 120,000 births annually. The difference in the number of birth centers in Georgia versus Florida and Texas is in part a function of the con laws, or the absence thereof in the 3 states. Per the National Conference of State Legislatures, Florida's con law does not apply to birth centers, and Texas, as has been noted, does not have a con law. The evidence shows that mothers who participate in birth center care, even if they have only prenatal care and give birth at a hospital, experience better outcomes, including lower rates of preterm delivery and cesarean births, and higher birth weights and rates of breastfeeding. Together, rural healthcare clusters, along with birth centers, will help save lives and bring hope to Georgia's rural citizens in a manner that is less costly, less traumatic, and more responsive to the needs of those dreams. Thank you for this opportunity to testify.
Thank you very much, Roland. Any questions from the committee? Okay, Senator Chairman.
I may have missed this. You may have already said it, Mr. Beam, but are there existing empath units in the state? And can you maybe send us some information?
There are no empath units currently within the state. There is, in a sense, a model of it at Grady in terms of their sort of separate facility. There are, as I mentioned, 13 that are in the process of being stretched to South Carolina. And I will forward to this committee for distribution information on empath units. And part of that will include a link to testimony provided by Dr. Scott Zeller. He was the person who developed empath centers about 18 years ago that he provided to Dr. Judy Fitzgerald's subcommittee at the Behavioral Health Reform and Innovation Commission.
Thank you.
Yes, Senator.
Thank you for your testimony. I see no further questions. Is Barry Heron here? Barry, go ahead and step down, if you would, please. And we don't have Senator Sims back, is that correct? Okay.
She is.
Floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Senators, ladies and gentlemen of the committee. I'm Barry Heron. We talked earlier this year with regard to the process of applying for a radiation therapy certificate of need in Augusta. Wanted to bring you up to date on that. It has been denied. I don't think anybody was surprised that was going to happen. However, you need to hear the reason why, because you should be as outraged as I am because of that. The point of our application was to access lower cost, 225% lower cost in a physician-based cancer environment instead of a hospital-based cancer environment. There is no physician-based cancer treatment for radiation therapy in Augusta. We mentioned this in our application as well as lots of community support for that. Here's what the department said in June in its denial letter. There were 4 reasons for the denial. The 2 that you should be bothered by are these 2. The applicant presented no evidence of excessive or atypical costs or charges from existing providers. And the applicant did not demonstrate that patients are currently unable to access radiation therapy because of cost. I want you to let that marinate for a minute, because it feels to me, and it should to you, that the standard that the department has imposed for remedying this cost barrier is that a patient has to decide whether they're going to buy something else instead of radiation therapy, or that the provider can charge whatever they want, right up to the point where a patient says, I can't afford to pay that. And just to resonate the comments that were made by members of the committee earlier in response to other testimony, Mr. Chairman, as you were asking the question, I was writing down, streamlining means deny things faster. Here's the important thing to remember. If a radiation therapy provider loses 89%, loses up to 89% of its business, or 11% goes down, right? They lose 11% of their business, they get to object. They have 89% of their patients, and they can stop somebody else from coming into the market. 2, licensure is not certificate of need. Accreditation is not licensure. Quality is not accreditation. Florida has addressed this with licensure and not with certificate of need. But I think it's very important to keep what the department has done in mind. 20 years ago, the Cancer Initiative was passed by this General Assembly and others. And it said that one of the things we're supposed to do is improve access to quality care for all Georgians with cancer. How's that worked out? I'll tell you exactly how that's worked out. Between 2006 and 2022, just that little measurement window, the number of people that own radiation therapy centers has gone down from 30 to 25. The number of hospital sites has gone up from 38 to 51. The number of non-hospital sites has gone down from 19 to 15. So in the time that we're supposed to be expanding access for people at a lower cost, remember that cost differential that Senator Kirkpatrick talked about, that hospital price versus that physician price. No facility fee payment for a physician service. During that 16 years, all we've done by empowering the department is to lower the number of units that are available to non-hospital providers by 10%, and exacerbated the problem of higher quality or higher cost providers when they purport in the regulations to advance the Cancer Initiative. To the senator's comment, it's exactly what the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice were worried about 20 years ago when all this information was brought forward to General Assemblies across the country. You're concentrating higher cost care in environments where the higher cost care providers can object to lower cost care. And that's exactly what's happened here. And this rule bakes that in, unless a person who applies can say, here's testimony from a real live person, or maybe now a real dead person, that couldn't afford to get cancer care at some place in my community because I had to buy food and groceries. If that's the standard, I just don't know how you get past that to say patients are currently unable to access services because of cost. You should also know that in the history of this rule, there has never been a CON application that's been granted based on a cost exception. Not one. So my question for the committee is, how bad does it have to get? How pricey does it have to be? What percentage does the hospital get to charge before the department will say, that's too much? I mean, I really wish that the commissioner was still here, because I would say shame on you for letting that rule be the public policy of the state of Georgia. That just can't be right. It can't be. And y'all have an opportunity to fix that by killing this thing before the department gets to make more decisions like this and prevent people from entering the marketplace without proof that somebody's gone without care before we'll allow a new entrant. Thank you very much. I'm glad to entertain any questions.
Seeing no questions, thank you for joining us again. Oh, I'm sorry. Chairman Watson.
Thank you for bringing this, and we haven't done in Augusta. You think it was the House CON? Is that where the testimony may have been? But anyway, just for point of order is that the 225% is a pretty major number when it comes to, I guess, what you're really referring to as inpatient versus outpatient.
Senator, it's actually the difference between hospital and physician payments, and that's just the difference in what Medicaid and the state merit system pay.
Medicaid and state merit, gotcha.
So the state of Georgia pays 225% more to have a patient treated for exactly the same condition in a hospital that you do in a physician practice.
For state health benefit plan. Gotcha.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, okay. So that's a pretty big number. Talk to me about quality a little bit.
Well, sir,
compare and contrast, if you would.
Well, quality, the American College of Radiology certifies all radiation therapy centers. You have to get a license, notwithstanding the fact that you have a certificate of need. You have to have a radiation safety officer who is an ACR certified radiologist. You have to have radiation oncologists that treat patients who are, in most cases, board certified in radiation oncology. I will mention to you that none of those things were a problem with this application, not a one. In fact, some of the providers that would be providing services already provide services at the hospitals in the same town. The problem is we can't show that somebody decided to buy food or pay rent instead of getting radiation therapy services. The bar, Senator, is so high that in 20 years, there has never been a successful applicant. Never. And so my question simply is, when is the state going to realize that it's been paying too much for care all this time? And does it really want its public policy to be somebody has to choose to do something other than pay for cancer care before we're going to give them some attention? And then how many of those people do there have to be before there's a need for that service? We don't know the answer because the department's never done it before.
Yes, it's interesting. I mean, so you're telling me that quality is the same, if not maybe done by the same providers.
In this particular circumstance, Senator, that's
in many
absolutely
situations. Right. I guess it's hard to argue that quality is not the same. So I get the cost. I mean, so for the state health benefit plans paying 225% more than they could be, and in states like, let me just, South Carolina, Florida, Texas, and that very conservative state, California, also doesn't have these issues, I presume.
Well, sir, I can only speak to South Carolina because my client practices in both states, and they can open a radiation therapy center in South Carolina in 18 months. In 18 months, for $4 million less than it would cost to do it in Georgia because of the regulatory and other burdens, and start seeing all the patients that they would be seeing in South Carolina. And And the hospitals in Georgia would still lose their 10%.
I got you. So because you're on the Savannah River, you can go over in South Carolina and open one up. And Georgia loses that opportunity because of our, I guess, archaic would be a good word. Because that's really sounds, that drives to a patient care standpoint and access standpoint. So that's ever so important. Thank you.
Yes, sir. I'm glad to answer that question.
Thank you, sir, for your testimony.
Thank you all very
Appreciate
much.
you being with us
Safe
again.
travels.
Absolutely. We have two more folks to hear from today. Jamie Kavanaugh is here. I'm going to ask Jamie to step down, and Gary Galloway, you're going to be the grand finale. Floor is yours, Ms. Kavanaugh.
Thank you. Good morning. Thanks for being here today, everyone. And talking about this important topic, I wanted to just address a couple of points that I heard today during the testimony. Remember that the original purpose of Certificate of Need when the federal government encouraged all the states to pass these laws was to decrease the number of facilities in order to control federal healthcare reimbursements. So of course, this point's been made many times, but when we're talking about access to healthcare, the original purpose of Certificate of Need was to slow down the growth of hospitals, decrease the number of hospitals, decrease the number of hospital beds. So of course we can't use Certificate of Need to increase access to care. It's not what it was designed to do. It was designed to do the exact opposite. And in fact, we know that it has been successful because when we compare to states without Certificate of Need laws, we see that those states have more hospitals per capita, more surgery centers per capita, more imaging centers per capita, more dialysis centers per capita. And unfortunately, patients in states with Certificate of Need laws have to travel further distances to get care and are more likely to leave the state to get care, which we've heard over and over about patients deciding to go to South Carolina to seek care. Another thing I think that's really important that we heard today is that Certificate of Need laws can't address problems with healthcare reimbursements. And of course, healthcare reimbursements are a crucial part of maintaining access to healthcare, but that's a separate discussion from whether or not and how we use Certificate of Need laws. Dr. Burke himself mentioned that direct payment programs don't have anything to do with CON, and the Georgia Hospital Association's recommendations included recommendations to increase reimbursement. And that's something that Certificate of Need laws on their face can't address. But another thing that goes along with reimbursement is this idea that we're shifting the cost of care to our privately insured patients. And of course, any business does that. That's normal cross-subsidization. Where this gets a little foggy is where cross-subsidization becomes cost shifting, which is this idea that a business or a hospital cannot stay open without that, versus, sure, we make more profit off some of the patients. But I think something that doesn't come up in these discussions is that half of the population here in Georgia has private healthcare insurance, and 1 in 5 Georgians has a medical bill in collections. So it might be attractive to say, yes, we have to cross-subsidize, and everyone understands that. But what is the level that we're doing that at? You know, you're pushing half of your population with private healthcare insurance. Many of them, you're pushing them into medical debt. So the solution can't just be, we have to put the privately insured patients on the hook for making up for all of the losses in the other areas. Again, that's a reimbursement issue, but for people who argue this is why we need to keep Certificate of Need law, to make sure everyone is going to the hospitals and paying hospital prices for all of their services, we're absolutely decreasing access to care. People are skipping needed services because they can't afford it. People are going into medical debt. So that's not good for access either. I also think it's important to mention that when we look at what other states have been doing, of course, it's been mentioned many times that South Carolina and Florida now don't have Certificate of Need. And the Pennsylvania Hospital Association has actually publicly said that it doesn't want Certificate of Need back. Pennsylvania got rid of Certificate of Need in 1999. And I think back around 2015, 2016, the legislature had some proposals to reintroduce portions of certificate of need. And the Hospital Association said we don't want that. Our members don't want to see that come back. And the Hospital Association today recognized that certificate of need is a complex statute. One of the recommendations is to rewrite the whole statute so that it's more straightforward. And I think a better way to do that would just be repealing certificate of need, or repealing portions of certificate of need. Instead of trying to redo this framework, which the Hospital Association admitted providers don't even seek certificates of need because it's so complex in some circumstances. And certainly smaller providers and providers who want to bring innovative services to Georgia, certainly they avoid the state because they don't want to go through this process. So instead of, I think, making some of these changes that just layer on more complexities to a statute that some people already find a little bit baffling and hard to navigate, a better idea is probably to just eliminate most or all of the certificate of need requirements. But if this committee does want to make some recommendations for process updates, I think that it would do well to follow states like Indiana, Louisiana, Michigan, Nebraska, New York, and New Jersey that don't allow competitors to intervene in the certificate of need process. Those states have very robust certificate of need programs, but they review applications without giving opposition the chance to intervene or appeal from a decision that they don't like. So just to sum up, Georgia's obviously an economic leader in so many ways, and it would be a shame if it falls behind in healthcare to its states, neighboring states like South Carolina and Florida. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
What were the states again?
Yeah, Indiana, Louisiana, Michigan, Nebraska, New York, and New Jersey. New Jersey does allow for some very, very limited circumstances where a competitor can intervene, but the rest of them is zero intervention by opposition. And I'm happy to send that list to the committee.
Great. I don't see any other questions for you. Thank you for joining our committee again. Thanks for the dialogue that you've had with us, and we'll see you in Atlanta as well. Lastly, we'll recognize Gary Galloway. Come on down, sir. Thank you for joining us today, sir. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. You'll see what I'm going to say. First of all, thank you for the opportunity to come before this committee. Please understand that my comments are intentionally devoid of any intent to negatively portray any healthcare facility or provider, because the fact that I am still alive is due to the medical treatment that I continue to receive. And a sub-note here, we have medical professionals in the room. So everything that I share is through the ears of a patient over the course of time. My name is Gary Galloway, and I'm a stage 4 non-small cell lung cancer survivor. In the fall of 2016, following 2 weeks in Ireland and travel to Colorado for my son's wedding, I began experiencing fatigue and shortness of breath while playing a round of golf. A visit to my family practice doctor in Monroe, Georgia, resulted in a siren and lights ambulance ride to Athens for a week-long ICU stay. On November 6, 2016, Dr. Petros Nikolinakos, known to many as Dr. Nick, and henceforth Dr. Nick, an oncologist, entered my hospital room and gave me the news that I had cancer. He shared with my wife, but not with me, that stage 4 non-small cell lung cancer is very aggressive and long-term survival is poor. 25 to 30% of patients with stage 4 non-small cell lung cancer die within 3 months of diagnosis, according to a 2021 study from the medical journal Frontiers of Oncology. That's not me, that's the journal. However, the remaining patients with stage 4 non-small cell lung cancer actually lived over 23 months on an average. Talk about outliving your expiration date. I'm living proof. Aside from the testing for genetic markers, I was told that I was going to need to have a PET scan as soon as the genetic test results were back. This was very new to me, and I laughed when I heard PET scan. I'd never heard it before. And the initial PET scan, followed by dozens since, was shocking. Dr. Nick told me that the injected radioactive glucose imaging showed up like the lights of the national Christmas tree. I experienced a number of physical side effects from the cancer, including clots in my legs, caused painful swelling, until the blood thinners and other medications became effective. I managed to spend 8 hours on December 24, 2016 at Piedmont's Athens Regional to receive a transfusion of 2 units of blood. My weight ballooned to 235 pounds, by contrast to what it is now, and I struggled to shuffle around using a walker. In early 2017, I started having difficulty breathing, and it was discovered that the cancer nodules had eroded the chest cavity wall, allowing for fluid to flow in, restricting the expansion and contraction of my lungs. I had a series of procedures where a long needle was inserted through my back to extract the fluid. The first time, 1,500 milliliters was collected. The second trip yielded 1,350 milliliters, and the final collection produced 1,100 milliliters of liquid. And I translate that into wine bottles, and that's a lot of wine bottles. Fortunately, my genetic markers indicated that I was able to begin treatment with Keytruda, an immunotherapy drug, shortly after ICU discharge. Dr. Nick, a noted researcher, had been conducting immunotherapy clinical trials research for years prior to my diagnosis. But I was one of the pioneers to be treated with this drug for my diagnosis since the U.S. Food and Drug Administration approved Keytruda. I won't give you the fancy name because I can't pronounce it, for treatment of patients with metastatic non-small cell lung cancer whose tumors express programmed ligand P1, blah, 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 as determined by an FDA-approved test. And they approved this on October 24th, 2016. So I was truly a lucky, lucky camper. In addition to numerous ultrasounds, CT scans, and x-rays, I've had quarterly PET scans since late 2016. And my most recent PET scan was this past Friday. So I may glow a little bit brighter than normal. The radioactive glucose grabs onto the cancer, so cancer cell locations, and any increased activity can be detected. If I've had a pause in immunotherapy treatment, the cancer seems to be more evident, and the term I use is frisky. But the friskiness is diminished on PET scans following immunotherapy, which knocks activity back. My treatment regimen at University Cancer and Blood Center in Athens has been appointments followed by immunotherapy IV treatment once every 3 weeks, with the exception of pauses. Through the course of this ordeal, I've had periodic side effects from the immunotherapy drug, but they are very distinct from the common chemotherapy treatment side effects, such as possible hair loss. It's gone anyway, or nausea. Instead, my PET scans have revealed opaque images to indicate possible onset of bronchiolitis, which manifests itself again as a shortness of breath problem. My 24 plus PET scans and 79 or 80 immunotherapy treatments have combined to successfully guide my treatment for almost 7 years. This treatment plan was enhanced by data gathered from clinical research with immunotherapy conducted by Dr. Nick and his team at University Cancer and Blood Center. Through the course of my treatment process, I've had my physical order stat diagnostic studies ordered because cancer is tricky and has many twists and turns. However, the PET scanner is in high demand, and there have been delays that have worried my doctor. If I extrapolate the scheduling hiccups that I've experienced through the years to include the diagnostic needs of a northeast Georgia catchment area that is fairly extensive, that's served by University Cancer and Blood Center, a sole PET scan site can end up shortchanging patients in the long run. There is nothing worse than the worry caused by delay, which drives fear of the unknown. In summary, I'd like to advocate for an installation of a PET scanner at University Cancer and Blood Center. Through the course of more than 100 trips to University Cancer and Blood Center, I've observed how difficult it is for some patients to even come through the door for their appointments for whatever kind of cancer. So if it's possible to reduce the variables for physically challenged and ill patients, this is a win for them, their families, and caregivers. I'm not a politician, and I'm not an expert on the many ramifications of the Certificate of Need rules, regulations, or laws. But I am a passionate patient who would prefer the comfort and convenience of one-stop shopping for my treatment in a familiar and compassionate care environment. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. Congratulations on beating the odds. And,
I'm not a happy camper. Any questions?
See if any committee has any questions. Seeing none, I can't think of a better way to end the day than your story.
Thank you.
Keep it up, and I'd tell you to come be a politician with us.